Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's webinar on building resilience. I'm Saffron, the school health professional at West Island School, and with me this evening is Claire Howarth, our Vice Principal for Pre-16, and Calvin Liu, our school counsellor.
Good evening everyone.
This evening's webinar is delivered by Grace Ho. So Dr. Grace is an assistant professor at the School of Nursing of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. She's committed to understanding the needs and improving the health and well-being of children, and her research aims to promote positive parenting and safe childhood, not least by strengthening mental health and resilience. Her current investigations focus on understanding the manifestations and promoters of resilience amongst youths experiencing adversity. And we can all agree that the last 2 years have been challenging. So we were thrilled to be asked to support Grace in her work, and our students participated in the survey. This gave us at school an insight into how our students are managing and a focus for our attention in building their resilience and supporting their mental health. I'm delighted to introduce Grace to share her findings and ways to support and build a positive outlook for young people facing life challenges. So we've had some questions already submitted, and I'd welcome you to add more to our Q&A box as we go through. Over to you, Grace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Saffron. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I hope everybody is keeping safe and staying well. As Saffron might have mentioned, I am a nurse by training, and my specialty is in understanding youth mental health, especially within the context of trauma and adversities. And earlier in my career, I focused a lot of work working with youths who suffered a lot of trauma and adversities early in their life, and particularly work within the field of child and adolescent forensic psychiatry. And it was really through those experiences working with youths where I realized not so much that we should look at the deficits, but more so focusing on their strengths and how to help them move forward and sort of create a meaningful outlook for the future ahead. So it is my great pleasure really to be able to give this webinar on how we can build resilience among youths. In the next 40 minutes or so in this webinar, we're going to be discussing what are the different types of stress, particularly in relation to how stress differs as it presents in adults versus in children and adolescents. And segue into that, we'll talk about what resilience actually is, what it means, how we can spot it. And then I'll also share some findings on how our youths are doing. And this is within the context of the recent survey that we've conducted within West Island School. And finally, hopefully provide some strategies and tips on how we as parents, as teachers, as a community can help support resilient outcomes. So let me go ahead and share my slides here. So hopefully along the way, I'll also be presenting some key messages in relation to the work that I have done. Hopefully I'm really looking forward to your questions and also further discussions on this topic. So going straight into looking at stress and how it differs in children and adolescents. So some key terms that require our definitions. First is looking at stress. So stress is really the pressure or demands that require adaptation or adjustments. A lot of times we think about stress as a negative thing, but that is not necessarily so, particularly if we are able to positively adapt and adjust to that stress. Now, the stressor is really the source of the stress, and it could be psychological or it could be very real life changes. And the key thing about the stressors is that we all perceive it differently. Something that could be very stressful to one person could be very benign to the next. So it's really important for us to be able to identify and articulate what are the stressors in our lives. And finally, distress is the state of physical or mental pain or suffering. So distress is a potential consequence of the stressors, but not definitely so. So the stressors causes stress, but it doesn't necessarily lead into distress. So a little bit of differentiation between how stress is presented for adults as opposed to for children and adolescents. So for adults, we have what we call acute stress, where it's sort of this one-time situation that require our immediate adaptation and adjustment. And when we talk about stress in adults, we have acquired the emotional regulation and management strategies and also coping mechanisms to deal with these stressors. Now, in more prolonged terms of how stress is presented, we have things called episodic stress, where these are stressors that sort of come up intermittently in our lives, which, it's somewhat expected for us. We anticipate for it. We know that these stressors will occur. It happens episodically and intermittently. It's not great, but we have the capabilities to respond to it. Now, of course, we've all heard about the concept of chronic stress. So that's the type of stress is more insidious. It's the type of stress that's always at the back of our minds. And as a result, it causes this wear and tear on our body. So you see a lot of more chronic illnesses stemming from sort of these chronic stressors. And it kind of speaks to our need to sort of have this long-term stress management strategies. Now, for children and adolescents, the types of stress that they experience are somewhat different. So for children and adolescents, there is something where we call positive stress. So these are the stressors that occur inevitably and that they themselves have the ability to make changes on and to overcome on their own. And in a sense, after experiencing these positive stress, they become more prepared and more ready to face future challenges because they can do something about it. They acquire the skills to do something about it. So a typical example would be like, a child or an infant learning how to walk. They fall and it's painful, but then they learn from it, they gain the balance, and then it's positive for them because eventually through falling, they learn how to get back up on their feet. Now, there are other types of stress where there's really nothing kids can do about. It's a situation that's beyond their control. They might not necessarily have the capacity to deal with them, but then they become tolerable when it occurs in a context of a warm, loving environment where there are adults who can support them through those stressors. And so in a sense, the stress becomes tolerable in the context of that warm, safe, loving environment. Now, what is very detrimental and very bad in a sense is what we call toxic stress. And these are the stress where there's not much they can do about it. There's not much they can do to change the situation. And it occurs in the absence of that warm, loving, safe environment. And so as a result of that, it really is toxic to their body. And what a lot of research has shown is that toxic stress actually changes neurodevelopmental pathways. So it literally changes the structures and the connections and the networks within their developing brain. And it sets a blueprint for how kids view and respond to the world in the future. So there's sort of two extreme ends of this continuum in terms of this atypical neurodevelopment. On one end, you might see kids who are very blunted in affect. They have a very blunted response to challenges. It's almost like they're giving up. They feel like there's not much they can do about the situation. Any attempts of fighting back is futile. So in a sense, they've decided to not even respond to it. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, you might see kids who are hyper aroused. They are very anxious and fearful, and they sort of sustain in that level of hyper arousal, hyper response. And this is coming from their sense of how unsafe this world is and how little they can do about it, but that they get this sort of physiological response, even if nothing is happening. So as you can imagine, on both ends of the continuum, it's not great. And I think a key here is for us to recognize that these are not, they're not responding by choice in those certain ways. Conversely, this is a very real autonomic physiological response to stressors, that they're not doing it by choice, it's just how their bodies are reacting to the situations. So my first key message here is that we do know that there is an antidote to stress. And that antidote is having one stable, warm, caring, responsive adult. So this person doesn't have to be a parent. It could be a teacher, it could be a counselor, a coach, someone who is willing to just be there and accept them and understand their situation. Now, this is particularly important because this one stable, warm, caring, responsive adult, they recognize that not all stressors have a solution. It's simply the act of being there and not necessarily tackling the problem, but tackling how we can better respond to the situation. So it's very much focused on the child and not really on the adversity or the situation. And what this person does is this idea of co-regulation. And really, particularly in the context of adolescents who are on the verge of, breaking off on their own, this idea of co-regulation helps to actually support their ability to self-regulate in the future. So when we talk about self-regulation, it's things like being able to make informed, wise decisions, being able to manage their emotions, taking control of their behavior, especially taking ownership of their behavior, and being able to adjust flexibly to the situation. So really within this context of co-regulation, there are three pillars, if you will. So the first aspect is really relational in nature. It's that warm, responsive, open sort of relationship that allows for open, honest communication. It's warm and caring, and that the responses are very timely to the child's needs. The second aspect would be the environment, providing structures, routines, and very clear expectations. And really for children and adolescents, this structured environment helps create a sense of safety and lets them know that even though the world out there could be very chaotic, within our relationship, you can certainly expect, have clear anticipations and expectations of what will follow. Now, finally, the last pillars are really skills-based, is about sharing, coaching, and modeling, particularly for parents, sharing our experiences, coaching them, and providing models of what a positive self-regulation look like. Now, for each of these three pillars, it really, the magnitude or the emphasis really differs across a child's developmental life stage. So for sure, the relationships is quite oftentimes a heavier focus in early childhood, really building that secure, safe attachment. Moving more towards sort of the preschool, school age, the environment is more of an emphasis, really providing them the structure and routine and building good habits. And finally, in early adolescence, it's time to give them the skills and provide the models, showing them how to engage positively with the world. And certainly by late adolescence and sort of young adulthood, the emphasis of these three aspects will become sort of more even, where it sort of becomes a full package of this co-regulation sort of environment, and to support them to more positively move forward and continue building on their self-regulatory skills. So what is resilience? Well, in some of my work, what I'm finding is that resilience is really self-regulation magnified. So when we think about managing emotions, taking ownership of behaviors, making right decisions for ourselves, in the context of resilience, all of those things are magnified. And a lot of times when we think about what resilience is, quite simply, we call it bouncing back, right? So we've all heard of the term bouncing back, how quickly someone bounces back. Are they able to bounce back when they face adversities? So part of the common notions, though, when we talk about bounce back, is that we look at an individual at a particular point in time and see how they're doing after something bad happens, right? And when we talk about someone who is resilient, they've bounced back, essentially a lot of times we say, you know, these people are unaffected by the situation. They are immune to these very challenging events in life, and almost like they're invulnerable to these negative experiences and occurrences. So as a result of that, a lot of times we label resilient people as strong, adaptable, or positive. So that got me thinking, well, if these are the words that we use to describe someone who is resilient, where does it leave the rest of us who are not bouncing back? Are we negative or weak or inflexible? So hopefully in the sort of following presentation, I'm able to perhaps shift that mindset a little bit more and reconstruct our way of thinking about bouncing back. And what we use to think about resilience is really that it's a trait. We look at people and we say, you know, you're either resilient or you're not. You either have it or you don't. It's a very black and white dichotomy on what resilience is. But what a lot of our current research is showing us, particularly for youths, is that resilience is really a process. Just as we're saying bouncing back is a ball in motion, resilience in itself, it's also something happening over time and in motion. So it's really a process that has sort of a temporal, sequential steps, if you will. So what we've done is we decided to look at resilience, I guess, more broadly and try to think of it as in a different light and trying to see, well, what does resilience really look like in the context of very severe adversities? And in some of our recent work, we have surveyed over 1,000 young adults all across East Asia, asking them, what is resilience to you? And how does that relate to your mental health? And we also selected a subsample of youths who've gone through a tremendous number of negative experiences early in life, but have shown that they're really doing okay. And we asked them, what was it like for you? And as a result of that, we found that there are generally 5 steps in this resilience process, and we'll go through them one by one. So step 1, for resilience to occur, something bad has to happen. So resilience really happens in the context of experiencing a challenge, experiencing tremendous stressors that require our adjustment and adaptation. Now, again, like I said earlier, you know, the stressor itself could be very personal and subjective. Something bad for one person might be something just fine for another. And what we find very important in terms of just getting to this first step is recognition and awareness. Having a vocabulary to voice the concern, to recognize that something is impacting our ability to do well, essentially. So first step, when something bad happens, it requires someone to recognize and be aware of the situation. Now, the second step is do something, anything. So you might see, you know, when something bad happens, we all react potentially very differently. Some of us might run off to a corner and cry, others might scream and shout. And really at this step, it's really an action for self-preservation. We do whatever it is that we can do, that we can think of, that could help the immediate situation. And what we found is a lot of times when we think about resilience, we kind of just stop there, right? We look at this sort of immediate reaction and we make a judgment on whether someone is resilient or not. But what a lot of research is finding is that, you know, even the most well-adjusted, high-functioning person, when they experience a tremendous challenge, there is a dip in well-being. And this is where this action for self-preservation takes place. So what really gets this process going are the following steps. The third step is asking, well, what have I done? So this requires a lot of insight and reflection and reanalyzing the situation, understanding the magnitude of the situation, but more importantly, how did I personally respond to the event? Recognizing what is it that I have done and how is it that I have reacted to the situation and how I am doing in response to that situation. Next, we ask ourselves, how can I move forward? And this is a very important step. This is a step that signifies sort of the motivation and the commitment to moving forward. What can I do to get myself out of this rut, essentially? So for youths, this would look something like help seeking, mobilizing resources, navigating and negotiating for the things that we need. Maybe it's building new relationships, foregoing bad behaviors or bad sort of past habits. And finally, the last step to sort of round out this process is to be able to tell ourselves that it's going to be okay. And this takes a lot of perseverance and courage, and generally have this good feeling about ourselves that we're going to be okay and we're going to be able to overcome, even if something bad happens again. And so I've presented this process as rather a linear process, but really it's a cyclical sort of process where, you know, after you feel it's going to be okay, something bad might happen again. And so you kind of keep cycling through this process. And the more times you are successfully able to cycle through this process, the more a youth is able to become resilient, that they are able to feel good about themselves. They recognize how they respond to situations. They understand they have to do a little bit of reflection and how they negotiate for resources that they need. So really every step of this process is a positive step towards building mastery motivation. And mastery motivation is a very powerful driver for resilience, particularly among youths. And what mastery motivation is once they've mastered something, they become more motivated to move forward. So think about it like a video game, right? Video games usually have various different levels, successive levels. And the reason why, instead of making one long game, they truncate it into different levels so that every time you succeed and pass a level, you feel a little better about yourself. So you have that sort of mastery, and then you become more motivated to keep going. So the second key message I have here is really resilience is about learning. Instead of thinking about resilience as a trait, we think about it as a learning process for youths. And really the process and timing is different for everyone. Just because someone is going through the process a little slower or faster doesn't mean that innately they're not able to achieve a resilient outcome. And more importantly, the goal of resilience is about moving forward with a positive outlook. A lot of times, particularly, you know, for us as parents, we think about how we can remove obstacles and solve problems for them. But in the context of building resilience, it's not about solving problems. It's about building up the person so that they become more resilient and ready to face the future. So essentially with a resilient person, we'll see that they would have a good positive outlook and sort of analyzed and created their meaning in life. They have more positive emotions. They're able to adjust their emotions. They are able to identify good social support. They have amassed more and more variety of different coping strategies, and more importantly, taking care of themselves. And that speaks to their physical well-being as well. So in the context of resilience, really every step is an opportunity for mastery as well as for support. And what we're seeing also is that, you know, particularly with how complex our world is now, you know, the steps sometimes get very jumbled up. It's not just sort of a step-by-step process and we go through the cycle, but many things could be happening at the same time at any given moment. And that they might be tackling sort of the different steps for different challenges, multiple different challenges that are co-occurring in their lives. So for us, it's we sort of have to be able to sort of make a prioritization to see, well, which step are we seeing our youths getting stuck in, and provide more support and skills and resources in those areas so that we can sort of help them smooth out that process. So speaking of which, I think it would be a good time to talk a little bit about what those immediate responses look like. So when something bad happens, through evolution, we know for survival, we just have to do something, anything. So what are some of the typical responses that we see in youths? And certainly in terms of identifying, a youth going through a tremendous amount of stress, we'll see these responses all together, all at once sometimes, but at the same time, sometimes they happen sort of gradually. So it really requires our close observation to see if there are any particular changes in behaviors and moods. So based on our interviews with a lot of youths who have gone through, a lot of stressors in their lives, we sort of uncovered 4 different typologies of responses to adversity. So very much like the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. So the first one I want to talk about is boast and undermine. And these are the teens who, when they face a challenge, they try to prop up themselves and they undermine the situation. So they would say, I don't care, it's not important to me, I can do better. And they also typically try to find faults in whoever has wronged them in the situation. So sort of a behavioral signature we see here would be blaming others. So finding someone to blame in order to make sense of the situation. And what we're seeing here is a bit more of a aggression, maybe anger, as sort of the overall package of what the boast and undermine response looks like. Another typology of response that we see is evade and disengage. So these are the sort of the people who hide out in the corner. They sort of want to isolate themselves socially, and they just want to disengage and run away from it all. And this is where we see perhaps some substance use issues, some addiction behaviors, just trying to get their mind off of things. And what we're also seeing as a behavioral signature is that they tend to really rely on themselves in solving the problems. They don't want to seek help. They don't think that anyone in the world can understand or help them solve their problems. Another typology of response that we've seen is what we call ruminate and obsess. So these are the people who sort of tend to overthink the situation. They run it through their head and in enormous amounts of details. And really, every time they think through it, they almost inadvertently re-traumatize themselves, thinking through the process. And they think a lot in terms of, why me? What could I have done differently? What was it that I did that caused the situation? So the behavioral signature is very much like blaming themselves. And certainly for this group, we saw a lot of mental health distress, a lot of depressive and anxiety symptoms. And finally, conform and please. So these are the people who sort of, something bad happens and their immediate response is, okay, what can I do to smooth things over and make everybody else happy again? Because if other people are happy, I'm going to be okay. And essentially for them, the solution to the problem is really sort of situated in others, that they really rely on others to tell them what is okay and what isn't okay. So you see a lot of pleasing behavior. They, they don't fight back. And they inadvertently also try to set very unrealistic goals and very high expectations for themselves because they believe this is what they have to do in order to, for bad things to not happen. So these are the 4 sort of immediate responses that we see. And what we also learned was that the type of responses that youths tend to choose has a lot to do with their temperament and their sort of individual constitution. And that's essentially based on two dimensions that we found. The first is how they manage control. So on one end of the continuum, you see those who dictate control. They want to hold on to the control, how the situation is framed, how the information about the situation is known to others, and they really want to just figure it out themselves. So they want to hold on to the control. So as you can imagine, for someone who boasts and undermine, they want to control the situation. They want to find the person that they can find fault in, as opposed to someone who evade and disengage. They also want to control the situation by just handling themselves and hiding away. On the other hand, you have those who completely relinquish control. They let go. They feel like they have no control over the situation. And that is where you see a lot of ruminating and obsessing, and also trying to please others. Another dimension related to how youths typically respond would be the way that they seek for solutions. On one end, you have those who are internal solution seekers, so really they turn inwards to find a solution to the problem. Again, ruminate and obsess, or if they evade and disengage, they just want to figure it out on their own. They run the situation over their head, in their head, or on the other hand, they might just completely run away and isolate themselves and disengage from other people socially. Certainly on the other end of the spectrum, you see that our external solution seekers, really they, we were looking at, well, what does this solution seeking mean? It's almost like, if someone has wronged you, how can you feel whole again? And for our external solution seekers, the solution is based in others. So either finding someone to blame, or they just want to please other people, so the problem will go away. So this brings me to my third message, which is that all initial responses are actually protective. The fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and they were developed evolutionary for our survival. And we have to respect those initial responses, because we sort of have to view it as the ability to sort of protect ourselves from the immediate situation. No matter how we respond, the responses are equally valid and important. It serves a very important purpose for survival. And again, the responses are driven by individual constitution, but also by their past experiences. So how have they handled situations before, and using that as a model and bringing it to our present challenges. And one note I sort of want to make here is also, as parents or as a family unit, be observant about how each of us tend to confront situations and challenges. And it could very well be that because our response styles could be very different, that it might lead to more conflict. So it's very important for us to sort of think through our own experiences, how we usually handle challenges, and then sort of step into our kids' shoes and sort of think about, well, what is it that they are trying to achieve through their responses at the present moment? And the key here is, when we observe these initial responses, that could quite often be potentially very distressing for us to see, is thinking of the goal of preventing this adaptive state from turning into a maladaptive trait. So think about how those responses are just temporary. It serves a very immediate purpose, but that if it prolongs for a while, that it might become maladaptive, as you can imagine. So I sort of think about it as, a long run, right? The form is important. And the most important thing, as we said earlier, going back into the concept of bouncing back, is to just always be in motion, always going forward in that process. Certainly, we need to give our youths time to express those responses, to make sense of those responses. But then if we observe that they're sort of stuck in one of those four corners, we need to think of ways to sort of help them get out of it. So this brings me to talking a little bit about how our youths are doing. And this is data based on the West Island school survey we did earlier in the year, which included 600 and some students, and nearly half of them were female. So these are the students who participated. And in the survey we've conducted, we primarily wanted to address 3 questions. What are their current concerns? How is their mental health? And how are they responding to challenges? So from the full sample of about 619 students, we first asked them, what are some of your common concerns? And we gave them a list of different concerns that they can check off on. On average, as a whole, across the 619 students, they have an average about 3 concerns that they're currently facing. So that's a pretty significant number of current concerns. And certainly the first one, the most popular one, would be academic performance. Almost 70% of those students reported on that. So, you know, a good thing and a bad thing, that they're very focused on their academics and they care a lot about their future. And following closely to that is related to health and safety. And this is not surprising given, you know, our current situation with COVID. And what we also did in the survey is we allowed them to provide, you know, a free text response to let us know if there are other concerns that they're currently facing. And the results were quite interesting. So sort of in descending order of the number of times these concerns were reported, a lot of students were able to articulate that their mental health is a problem or is a concern for them currently. And this is, you know, a good sign that they actually are able to recognize and they are aware that their mental health is not doing so great, and that they have the vocabulary to express it. Following that, identity and insecurity, so things related to gender and sexuality and their appearance. So not at all uncommon for emerging young adults. A lot of them were also concerned about their future, particularly related to career, university, growing up. So they do have a longer term goals that they set for their lives, and that they you know, do think a lot about their future, and they are concerned about it. The fourth one relates to environment and society, and I think that speaks to their global perspective. So some of them talked about COVID. Others talked about disasters, and there were some who also talked about current events. What is happening, you know, with the state of affairs, you know, with war and conflicts. And so this sort of speaks to their global perspective as well, understanding they're part of a larger global community. And finally, relational problems. So certainly for their age, romantic relationships is a big one. But probably something that is also specific to the international school community is, you know, having friends moving away or being apart from family members. In relation to the mental health, we asked them about their symptoms of possible depression, anxiety, and stress. And what we found is that female students reported higher levels of each of the 3 different forms of symptomatology. So for females, moderate levels of depressions were reported as a whole across sort of on average for female students, moderate to severe levels of anxiety and mild levels of stress. For male students, it looks like it's a little bit more mild in presentation. But also of note is we do know that females tend to be more vocal and open about sharing their mental health concerns. So it could be sort of a gender difference in reporting and not necessarily sort of a translation of how they actually feel at that moment in time. And finally, we also asked them about the types of response to adversity. So based on the 4 different typologies of responses, which are the strategies that they tend to use as an immediate response to stressors? So on average, as a whole, among the students who completed the surveys, a lot of them reported conform and please as a strategy, followed by evade and disengage, and then ruminate and obsess, and finally boasting and undermining. And I do want to say we did a little bit of additional analysis, and we found that the first 3 types of responses were moderately correlated to depression and stress, whereas the 4th, boast and undermine, is not. And this is not necessarily saying that, boast and undermine is the typology of response to go for, because as you can imagine, in the long run, social relationships could suffer from it. So I think the message here is really thinking about, giving our youth the confidence to be themselves, to express themselves, and particularly important for them to generate that identity and be comfortable with being themselves, really, right? As they, move forward and become a young adult and to stand on their own. So this brings me to probably one of the biggest question, what can we do to support resilient outcomes? And so I think in the following slides, what I'm trying to do is really present strategies and some of the potential ways that we can better support the resilient outcomes. But then again, it really goes back to parents' keen observations and of what is going on with the situation, the types of challenges our youths are facing, and how they're responding to those challenges as well. So supporting for every step of the process. So when something bad happens, it's very important for us to provide empathy and companionship, and really thinking about the context of, again, co-regulating, right? To just let them know that there is someone warm, responsive, who is there for them. And again, in order to usher forward that resilience process, it's not about solving problems for them or even with them. It's about helping them learn about themselves. For the second step, once they are reacting to the situation, it requires our acceptance and understanding, and really recognizing that it's a temporary thing and that for them it's protective. Even if they are not faring very well at the moment, it's in their world the best way to protect themselves and respond to the situation. When they're ready to do some reflection, help them talk it out, provide feedback. And, a lot of times at this stage, it's our role is really just to help them articulate what we observe. I'm seeing that you have been staying in your room for a week. Let me know when you're ready to talk about it. So so just providing that open opportunity for channels of communication. When they're ready to move forward, it's our role to help them link up with resources and different opportunities. And again, not for us to solve their problems for them, but really just to give them, different strategies to work with and experiment with. And finally, when they're, having a positive outlook, feeling like, they're doing a little better, they're sort of coming out of the gloom, to acknowledge and encourage them and let them know that really, about their efforts to try to come through. So probably, as you can see across the 5-step, there's a lot of co-regulation going on. There's a lot of relational work going on, just being there, supportive, sensitive, warm, responsive. There's a lot also, providing that structured environment, the setting expectations, and there's also a lot of skill sharing going on. So finally, some response-specific strategies. So if you're observing that maybe, your child is showing, any one of these sort of responses at the moment, they're facing a challenge, well, what are some things that we could do? So first, in relation to the way that they are handling control, what we're finding is a trust building is a very important aspect, particularly for those who are, really holding on to their control. Provide them with resources and avenues to learn how to trust other people, as opposed to those who are relinquishing control, learning how to trust themselves. So more specifically for trusting others, sharing with them skills about listening and observing. A lot of times, people say one thing and do another. And that's just how we are as human beings. You know, we can be very conflicting, contradictory beings. So teach them skills on listening and observing and making judgments after they've made the observations. Talk about psychological flexibility, how the world is nuanced, not black and white. Validating and reiterating what you're observing so that they know that, you know, you're there. Providing structures and routines, and again, setting clear expectations so that, you know, they know that there are expectations that they can meet and that they are clearly lined out for them. On the other hand, to establish more trust in themselves, provide opportunities for success, giving them small tasks that we know they can achieve, help them identify their strengths, be it hobbies or sports, encourage their self-expression, let them know that it's okay to be yourself, help them set personal goals, and also focus on their own happiness. In terms of the ways of different types of solution seeking, we found that, you know, the idea of nurturance is also very important, particularly for emerging adults. How do they help nurture themselves, and also how do they help nurture others? So in terms of nurturing others, as you can imagine, for those who are internal solution seekers, they're very much in their heads, right? So we want to get them out of their heads, you know, give them volunteering or volunteering experiences, or just ways to contribute, even just around the household. Encourage them to sort of think from different perspectives, stepping into other people's shoes. Talk about the meaning of service, particularly with everything that's going on in the world right now, widening perspectives, and help them situate themselves in the world and how they can make a difference. And finally, certainly promoting this idea of gratitude and appreciation. So maybe doing like a gratitude circle at night during dinner time, just going around, what is one thing that you're very thankful for today? And finally, to nurture themselves, this is where we want them to focus more on building up themselves. So self-care and me time, setting appropriate boundaries between themselves and other, learning, you know, how to say no or what is not okay, celebrating their successes, and others practicing forgiveness, both for others and also for themselves, that it's okay to be them. And also making meaningful connections, you know, what does it mean to develop a meaningful, real, genuine friendship, and also build on sort of that meaningful relationship between you and your child. And ultimately, once they've sort of tried out all these things and tested them out, ultimately the goal is for them to increase this sort of self-writing capacity. And what we mean by self-writing is very much like a boat. You know, the boat recognizes that it's sort of tipping over, and immediately it tries to correct itself. And this is what all these strategies are trying to do, where, you know, when a youth is able to recognize something is off, they're feeling off, they're acting off, they recognize it, and then they look out for resources and strategies to try to right themselves again. So my last key message here is really, you know your child best. Through all of the, you know, research and the interviews we've done, we found that the resilience process is really idiosyncratic. There is no one straight path to it, and there's really no any correct path to it. It's really based on the individual, and it happens through experimentation and feedback, particularly with our support within this co-regulation interaction. And it builds through each successive cycle through the process. And a key here again is to help them push forward through those 5 different steps in the resilience process and not get stuck. And so with that, my final message here is observe closely, act responsively, communicate openly, and respond creatively. So thank you so much. Here's also my contact information, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. There were so many takeaways from that really bespoke insight into West Island students and in the context of your work. I think when I first saw your work, my first thought was as a nurse, as an adult working with young people, like how we can facilitate them working through these stages that you've presented of resilience as a process, without the need to jump in, to solve, to fix things and get straight to step 5 as everything will be okay, We were so pleased to see that your response-specific strategies really do seem to align with how we present resources under our 5 ways to wellbeing of tuning in, connecting, being active, learning, and service. So we've shared our wellbeing Padlet following the Mental Health Week a few weeks ago, which is currently being adapted into a website, so parents can access that through our bulletin. But we have had some parent questions submitted and also a few whilst you've been talking as well. So the first question was, how can parents better explain the coping strategy of letting go of negative experiences, thoughts, or emotions?
Certainly, that is a wonderful question. And I think it depends on what we think about the idea of letting go, right? So a lot of times we think about letting go in terms of just forgetting about it, get over it, letting go, move on. But really, with emotions and experiences and thoughts, they should really be additive and not subtractive, not trying to get rid of, those negative experiences. Really how we can help transforming those feelings and ideas and feelings and experiences into positive ones to build on that positive outlook. So, on one hand, we do want them to keep moving forward and present a resilient outlook, a positive outlook in life, but really not letting go or forgetting their past. It's all part of their life story and we need to embrace it.
Thank you. And then the next question is, how are diet and exercise part of this conversation?
Sure, that's also a very important aspect of it. And as you can imagine, no matter which sort of typology or corner they end up in, there could be potential sort of ways to take better care of ourselves physically. And I think this goes back to that idea of co-regulation, providing skills, setting examples, modeling. For us to provide support, the best way we can support better diets and taking better care of our themselves is for us to take better care of ourselves and do it as a partnership. So maybe do, healthy cooking together and, exercising together.
I think Grace might have dropped off, unfortunately. Okay, we do have a few other questions. So what I will do is I'll pose them to Grace when we can get hold of her, and we'll send those out in terms of answers to you parents after. So that's all for this evening. Obviously, thank you to Grace when she comes back for giving us, firstly, for letting us be part of her study and tonight sharing her knowledge and experience with us. And thank you parents for joining us this evening. We'd really welcome your comments and feedback as you exit. Thank you.
Good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.